Dr. Savi. Okay, and our last speaker is Professor Dr. Aybet, who will be speaking about good governance and the challenges of multilateralism.
Thank you very much. Good evening again, everybody. I'm going to talk more from an international relations perspective on global governance and good governance practices as they have become dominated in global governance. So I want to start off by talking about what global governance is. Basically, it's different ways in which organizations, institutions, and governments manage their affairs with certain laws, regulations, and customs, standards, and of course, norms. Good governance in the global governance sense means that these affairs are managed well, not necessarily that the rules and regulations themselves are good. So I guess, there's a difference between good governance within society and states and good governance in the global sphere. So first of all, I wanted to sort of put that forward. So when we talk about good governance in international relations, in the global sense, it basically means that all of these affairs are managed well, but not necessarily, doesn't really question whether the rules that are laid down are necessarily good. Global governance at the end of the day is really about, it's an international process really, about how consensus is formed. And at the end of the day, that consensus is usually formed through power relations. So again, it's very different from what we talk about good governance within states when, the previous speakers have also talked about such things as, social contracts and norms and values. This doesn't mean that in international governance, we don't have norms, we do. But then the problem that lies with global governance and good governance in the global sense is that how those norms are applicable, or if they mean anything to everybody, and how all these relations get managed. So I just want to roll things back to 1945, because I guess the global governance as we know it really started then with the end of the Second World War. And it really has become a Western dominated practice. I suppose that's a very wide way of looking at it, but if we say that there's a transatlantic core that dominates global governance practices, I suppose that would be much closer than the more broad term Western. There's also an sort of, obviously that the situation, the power relations at the end of the Second World War led to the creation of various international institutions, and these became the bedrock of global governance. But it's actually from the 1990s onwards, with the fall of the Soviet Union, that we see a lot of the institutions that were created to preserve what was called back then a so-called Western Bloc became kind of integrated with the larger institutions, such as the truly global institutions, such as the United Nations, and which is the embodiment of international law as we know it, into a larger picture of a transatlantic dominated global order, if you like, a liberal international order. Within this order, because its roots are so much embedded in the 1945 setup, there's also a certain oughtness. I know that's not a real word, but I tend to use it a lot. Oughtness means that, somebody tells you this is the way it ought to happen. This is the way good governance should be. This is the way how countries ought to be. And this is actually very much part and parcel of this whole setup, if you like, of international institutions and how they're dominated by the practice, if you like, of a few powerful states. And you can see this very much in the writings as to how diplomacy ought to be conducted and how countries ought to conduct themselves. Even in the writings of George Kennan, you can find these when he's talking about the Soviet Union and how it ought to conduct itself as a government among governments. And that, I think, phrase says it all, a government among other governments. governments means that, you belong to a certain club and you have to follow the club rules. And therefore, there are certain ways that you ought to behave. Now, all of this is very good, of course, because in a sense, there's a benign side to this when we look at how much states do actually value order. And therefore, they need to have some sense of predictability as to how other countries are going to behave towards them and how they're going to behave towards other countries. So they like to see that continuity and that stability and order because it helps them in their transactions internationally. Therefore, they will actually impose certain rules and regulations that will inhibit them as well, that will put strains on their behavior as well. And they do this voluntarily for the simple reason that they would like to have order in the international system. Now, that is the good side of it. The bad side of it, of course, is that this creates an entirely sort of, especially since the 1990s, and given the lack of alternative regional power rivalry that existed immediately after the Cold War, a sort of predominance of, let's say, Western in the broader sense, domination of global governance and what good governance means. And this has brought us way into 1995 with the multilateralism versus sovereignty dilemma, with concepts such as responsibility to protect. And beyond that, the lack of, in the incapacity actually of international institutions to actually implement concepts that they've created themselves, like responsibility to protect, not because they were hindered by the concept of sovereignty, but because they couldn't agree on what it meant among themselves. And that is precisely why the UN Security Council has been deadlocked since the NATO-led operation in Libya, because after that, Russia said that they would no longer endorse any Western or US-led operation, even for humanitarian purposes, if it was going to lead to regime change. So again, you get these different interpretations about what is right and wrong in the international system. We've come full circle of the 1990s, where everything is imposed in a very top-down fashion, to an absolute deadlock in how international institutions work. Part of this, I also want to talk about good governance in post-conflict reconstruction and state building. This is also an important part of the 90s, where we saw international institutions taking on unprecedented roles in intervention for humanitarian reasons, in intervening in these countries and regions, and then putting together an entire process of state building, from writing to constitutions to delivering good practices of good governance and what it ought to be like. The one example that comes to mind is Bosnia in this respect, because the conditions there were imposed in a top-down pattern, and they never met this top-down imposition of governance and norms, never met with the actual coming together at the grassroots level of sustainable peace at the grassroots level. So there was actually a disconnect between an internationally imposed top-down state building and the collective growth of local, if you like, norms on sustainable peace at the grassroots level. And the reason for that is because I called this, I did a lot of work on Bosnia. This is why I thought Bosnia would be a good example as well, because it sort of very much sort of embodies this sort of Western dominance at this time of, what good governance practices mean in the international context. So it comes down to what I call norm transfusion. It's not necessarily norm diffusion, whereby, the international community brings forth a set of norms that are then accepted by local elites in a country, and then these trickle down to society, where they become welded, if you like, or grafted with local norms and local culture, where then it becomes its own, you know, it becomes something else. It doesn't become top-down imposed, it becomes local and universal at the same time. Now, when you have the imposition of state building like you did in Bosnia and many other places, you don't have this diffusion where, you know, the local norms get socialized, if you like, and taken on. Instead, you get a transfusion, like a blood transfusion of norms, but they don't really get internalized. And this is one of the main problems, I think, of 1990s practices of state building. And the way in which international institutions were used during this process for building, if you like, states, you know, and based on the values and the norms of liberal internationalism. So free market economies, democratic institutions, human rights, all of these norms were built into the discourses that went into state building in the official documents of the time of NATO, the EU, the OSCE, the UN, the World Bank, all kinds of institutions that are, you know, the bedrock of global governance, if you like, going into a place like Bosnia to engage in state building. So they were writing the norms there. But with, you know, norm transfusion, which is basically the direct imposition of norms in this way, really, as I mentioned, bypasses the local networks. And this is because domestic institutions as such, in any case, are weak in post-conflict societies. So this is a problem in all international efforts to induce good governance through state building in post-conflict societies. You get a set of externally imported norms. They get transfused through elites to governance, but they rarely trickle down to grassroots. So the problem is not unique to Bosnia. And most Western-dominated attempts at state building and post-conflict reconstruction around the world have come across this problem. So, but Bosnia, like I said, is a very good example of Western dominance in the discourses and implementation of good governance and the use of global governance and multilateralism as tools to achieve this. So it was just, I suppose, an example in this sense. But when we look at the wider picture of global governance, there, in the 1990s, this transatlantic core that dominated all of these practices has not gone away, and it still leads and shapes international thinking on global governance, and it still leads and shapes what good governance ought to be. And this is very important because I think right now, when we do leave the post-1945 situation behind us, when we leave the 1990s behind us, what we have reached now is the global order itself going through a transition. But who are the dominant shapers of discourse in global governance? Once again, it's this transatlantic core. Now, that leads us to the question, which I suppose is the main issue of this whole conference. Where is the Muslim world in all of this? And how the discourse on how Muslims fit into this world order and revisions of it, again, that discourse seems to be largely Western dominated. And there's twofold, there's two aspects to this discourse. First, there's the Muslim states, or states that have a majority of a Muslim population. And then there are Muslim societies in the Western world. So the way dominant discourses look at Islam in a sort of predominant liberal world order is, you know, how, first of all, do Muslim states or states with large Muslim populations fit into world order or global governance? And secondly, Muslim societies in Western countries and how they fit in there. With the second one, that is Muslim societies in Western countries, there is a dilemma for liberalism. Because on one hand, you have the so-called goodness of multiculturalism, multi-faith, pluralist societies, which liberalism does endow, versus the growing Islamophobia that comes not only just from right-wing or racist movements against pluralistic values, but Islamophobia can also come from liberalism itself. Because as Western embedded liberal values are more aggressively and defensively imposed contrary to cultural and religious beliefs of others, then you find tensions coming there from liberalism itself as well. When it comes to states or Muslim states, again, the classification of these states in dominating Western discourse on global governance, again, is very simplistic, because you either look at them as proxies, partners, allies, or those states that are anti-globalism, anti-systemic, and therefore disruptors. So there's an either-or classification there when it comes to states, but with societies in Western countries, Muslim societies, there's tensions due to Islamophobia coming from right-wing movements that are anti-plural, but Islamophobia also coming from liberalism itself, as liberalism becomes more threatened and aggressive, if you like, in imposing its own values. This brings us to the question, when we talk about societies, Muslim societies in the West, is what kind of pluralism are we talking about? Is the Muslim world expected to fit into a certain idea of Western defined pluralism? Is it expected to comfortably sit in a Western defined pluralist society as part of something bigger? Can Muslim societies living in Western countries accept this definition of who they are as social beings? And if they raise objections to this conception of pluralism and keep themselves to themselves, are they then seen as anti-systemic, anti-pluralist, anti-liberal, and therefore anti-good governance? So there's also a sequence of logic there in this discourse that takes you down to being anti-good governance because you're against anti-pluralism. So all of these, in Europe particularly, are a profound problem. Now, we mentioned that within these societies, you have two tensions, one from right-wing, more sort of racist backlashes, but also from a very strictly imposed liberalism itself. Add on to that issues of national security and counterterrorism. It's a huge problem for particularly Europe, where you find that Muslim societies are under greater imposed scrutiny, harassment, even due to national security concerns. So all of these three things, the national security, the right-wing movements, increased pluralism that is becoming increasingly imposing, all of these have an effect on how non-Muslim parts of these societies look upon their Muslim neighbors. And that creates a fourth ring of tensions. So how to fix this problem? I think it all starts with the bigger picture. As to, if we go back to states, I mean, I just talked about Muslim societies in the West, but if we think about Muslim states or states with predominantly Muslim populations in this whole global system, it really starts with that bigger picture. If they are given a better share in global good governance practices, this is bound to trickle down to Muslim societies in Western countries. And a lot of the anger in Muslim societies in the West comes from observing the Muslim world, i.e. Muslim states, excluded from global practices of governance, which are still dominated by the transatlantic court. Now, I know a lot of liberals will probably put their hands in the air and say, well, Muslims are not excluded actually from global governance, but you have to also look at it from the perspective of Muslim societies in the West, and some of these attempts to put a Muslim presence in global governance sometimes is perceived as putting a token Muslim for window dressing, which isn't going to work either. So in this picture, Muslims should not be viewed by those who dominate the liberal world order, that is the transatlantic core, as a mere attachment to a liberal notion of pluralism. And I think this brings us to the final section of my talk, which is going to be about where we are now. So, you know, at the juncture of shaping a changing world order. As the world order is going through a very grand realignment process, I wouldn't call it a redesigning like I suppose 1945 was a designing of an order, 1990 was designing of an order, but this, I think, is definitely a realignment or a readjustment because no one has the power or the monopoly to design anything anymore in the international system. So in this realignment or readjustment, we actually see in the international system the emergence of three realities or three challenges. The first of these is the return of great power rivalry. The rise of Russia and China have really posed a very existential challenge to the dominant liberal world order and those who would like to maintain it. So the return of great power rivalry is the first reality. The second reality is, I suppose, something that doesn't really get read in great detail by the Muslim world, but it's actually a crack, if you like, within the Western world, which is profoundly affecting this realignment. And it's an ideological clash between those who are trying to preserve a liberal world order inherited from the 90s and those who have an anti-globalist, anti-pluralist agenda, who are inward-looking mercantilists who also unfortunately feed off right-wing movements. So this ideological clash is not really happening in the Middle East or in Asia or anywhere else. It's happening in the West and in Europe, in America. And again, this is very interesting. The challenges for the liberal world order created by the West is being challenged also with an ideological struggle from within itself. The third reality at this juncture of change is the emergence of what I suppose is a needs-based order after COVID-19. When I say a needs-based order, we're really, I think, more and more going to see transnational transactions increasing. For example, the rush to create the vaccine was one example of this, how we actually saw different scientists from different countries, different companies, different regions of the world, sometimes in competition, but mostly we see a lot of cooperation coming out of this. So if there is an urgent need for a commodity that the whole world needs, we see more cooperation that transcends nations and countries. And this, again, I suppose, is not so much of a challenge to the liberal world order as it stands, but it's something new. It's a new reality that it has to sort of internalize and adjust to. So the next question I suppose I have is like, where does the Muslim world stand with regards to these three realities or challenges to the present international order? Are we seeing an ownership by the Muslim world on these approaches to tackle these three challenges? The ideas to tackle these three challenges, again, are predominantly rising from a transatlantic core. And there are two ideas that have so far emerged. And in these two ideas or notions that are being put forward, again, we're seeing the Muslim world not there quite, but it's still the beginning. I mean, I'm sure that somewhere down the road, this will be addressed. But in the beginning, the Muslim world is sort of silent, invisible in this. The first is the World Economic Forum's Great Reset, which is trying really to recreate or sort of adjust a liberal world order, renew a capitalist world order by addressing the issue that has left us with the post-COVID crisis, that is resilience of societies, and also to rebuild trust in international institutions. But again, the way the reset is being approached right now, I'm sure somewhere down the line this is going to be addressed, but it's still new, is quite simplistic in the way that it's also already lumping those who are for pluralism and those who are against, those who are populist and those who are anti-global. And these, I think, are very simplistic divisions that don't help us to understand this great transition that the world is going through. And I think the Muslim world, Muslim states have a lot to contribute with their ideas about global justice. Turkey has been, our president Erdogan has been, a champion of this. Every year at the UN, he talks about, global justice and issues and the need for UN reform and how the world is now bigger than 5, which it undoubtedly is. So all of these things, I think, need to be brought to the attention of the Muslim world more, rather than having an inward-looking reflection on good governance. We really need to understand, where is global governance now? What are the challenges? What could be our positive input into these processes? How can we actually become a stakeholder? How can we help to shape these things? And I think that is going to be a very important challenge for the Muslim world. The second idea that's been floating around, again, coming from this transatlantic core, is the idea of a D10, a democracies of 10 countries. Of course, this could grow, still the beginning. The idea is to include Australia, South Korea, and India into the G7 sort of framework, to have a sort of global alliance of democracies. Again, it's going to be democracy as defined by a very sort of Western definition of it. And again, it all depends if this is going to be something very exclusive and or something that is aiming to be inclusive in good governance. Because at the end of the day, when you're talking about an alliance of democracies, you're really talking about good governance. And one has to really look at the intentions behind this, and the fact that it should be more inclusive, I think, is very important. So final word, I think also from what I have said throughout my paper is that a lot of these practices that have come to evolve since 1945 and after 1990s have really been power driven. So it's the powerful in the international system that define the norms, impose the norms, maintain control over the international institutions that safeguard the norms. But I think after COVID, our definitions of power are also going to change, which is precisely why initiatives such as the Grand Reset, initiatives such as the D10 are going to look more and more into this challenge as well, like what is power? For example, the COVID crisis also taught us one thing, that it's not necessarily the most economically or militarily powerful that can go through a crisis unscathed. It's the countries that have the greatest capacity to adapt to crises, to adapt in international crises, and who have the most resilient societies that are going to come out more powerful after this. So our concepts of power are also changing. There's a profound realignment going on. And I think it's very important that the Muslim world finds its place in it. Thank you very much.